Hey out there. This video is a focus on To Kill a Mockingbird's chapters 8 and 9. And this analysis assumes that you've read all the way through chapter 9 and are ready to do a deep dive on chapters 8 and 9. So before we begin, we're actually going to look at chapter 7 as a quick review. All right, so a quick review on chapter 7 and some of the highlights from that chapter, particularly some of the plot points regarding the stuff that Jem and Scout find in the tree. Those items are becoming more and more personal. Those soap dolls that were carved to look exactly like them, the watch, the spelling bee medal, these are all items that Jem and Scout really think are cool. And the soap dolls in particular mean that someone has been paying close attention to Scout and Jem. So Jem has a bigger realization about the items than Scout does. They do make a decision together to write a thank you note to whomever is leaving those items. And at the end of the chapter, Mr. Nathan Radley cements the hole in the tree and says that the tree is dying. Atticus says it's not, and it causes Jem to cry. It causes him to have a very emotional response. And so the question we looked at the end of chapter 7 is what kinds of inferences can we make at the end of chapter 7 and the plot points that we've seen so far? Or another way to think about this question is really what has Jem inferred that Scout has not? And Jem is thinking that it is Arthur Radley who's leaving the items in the tree. Scout hasn't figured that out. She has no idea why Jem is crying, but Scout doesn't realize it, but Jem realizes that Arthur Radley is using the tree as a way of communicating with these kids, and he hasn't had a way to communicate with anyone for years and years. So Jem has an emotional response to that outlet of communication being taken away from Arthur Radley, but Scout doesn't get it. So this brings us to a writer's craft move that I want to point out. So if Jean Louise Finch or Scout is our narrator, it's a limited first person point of view, meaning that we know everything that she is thinking, but we're limited to just what Scout is thinking, just what Jean Louise is thinking. But in a twist on point of view, Harper Lee tells the story from a point in the future. The book begins, when we were far enough past the event that happened, we could look back and talk about it. So she's writing from the point of view of someone who's grown up, but she's telling the majority of the story through Scout's eyes at the young age of being in second grade. So she limits her future knowledge, which allows us as a reader to make inferences and draw conclusions that Scout couldn't when she was young. So as Scout is telling us things about her perspective from the second grader point of view, we get to draw conclusions. We get to make inferences that occasionally older Scout can kind of chime in on. And we want to look for those writer's craft moments when older Scout is giving us some insight, but still giving us the chance as the reader to make our own inferences. It's one of the reasons why this book is so eloquently crafted and why it still stands the test of time. All right, so now as we move into chapter 8, we do find out that Mrs. Radley dies of natural causes, much to the kids' disappointment, but she dies in her sleep of natural causes. And the next morning, there's snow, and there hasn't been any snow since 1885. So school is closed, and Scout thinks the world is ending, and they have a great time trying to build a snowman. Where in the chapter I'd like to focus our attention is that evening. So in the middle of the night, Ms. Maudie's house catches on fire, and Scout and Jem go outside, and Atticus tells them, now listen, both of you, I'm right down here. Go down and stand in front of the Radley place. Keep out of the way, do you hear? See which way the wind's blowing? Oh, said Jem. Atticus, reckon we ought to start moving our furniture out? Not yet, son. Do as I tell you. Run now. Take Scout with you here. Don't let her out of your sight. So houses catching on fire, the risk was so much higher. It took a long time to get the word out, to get fire trucks. You see in the chapter that fire trucks from different counties are had to come in. The real concern is that other houses are going to catch fire as well. So that's when he's saying, is it time yet? Is it time yet? They're saying, is it time for us to go and get our stuff out of our house? And there are several times when Jem says to Scout, it's not time. You don't need to worry yet. I love this line right here. I saw Atticus carrying Miss Maudie's heavy oak rocking chair, and I thought it sensible of him to save what she valued most. So, while people are grabbing whatever they can, Atticus went straight for what he knew that Miss Maudie loved. Again, not time to worry, not time to worry. We'll know when it's time. She does become aware that she is so cold. The men who are working in the fire are sweating and stripping down, and she's getting colder and colder as she's out there. When they get back to the house, and it's just Miss Maudie's house that gets burned to the ground, the other houses are stay safe. As we drank our cocoa, I noticed Atticus looking at me, first with curiosity, then with sternness. I thought I told you and Jem to stay put, he said. Why, we did. We stayed. Then whose blanket is that? Blanket? Yes, ma'am, blanket. It isn't ours. I looked down and found myself clutching a brown woolen blanket I was wearing around my shoulders, squaw fashion. Atticus, I don't know, sir. I turned to Jem for an answer, but Jem was more bewildered than I. He said he didn't know how it got there. We did exactly as Atticus told us. We stood down by the Radley gate, away from everybody. We didn't move an inch. Jem stopped. Mr. Radley was at the fire, he babbled. I saw him. I saw him. He was tugging the mattress. Atticus, I swear. That's all right, son. Atticus grinned slowly. Looks like all of Macomb was out tonight in one way or another. Jem, there's some wrapping paper in the pantry, I think. Go get it, and we'll. Atticus, no, sir. So this is another moment when we're seeing things through Scout's eyes, and we're meant to make an inference or meant to draw a conclusion that Scout can't. Scout can't figure this out, but we're meant to. Atticus and Jem have figured it out. Mr. Nathan Radley was at the fire helping. Mrs. Radley died at the beginning of this chapter. There's nobody else left in the Radley house. They were told to go stand by the Radley gate. There's nobody else left who could have put that blanket around them. Process of elimination, it's Arthur Boo Radley. And so Atticus says, go get some wrapping paper, meaning we'll wrap up the blanket and we'll return it. And Jem immediately loses his mind. Jem seemed to have lost his mind. He began pouring out secrets right and left in total disregard for my safety, if not for his own, omitting nothing, not whole pants and all. Mr. Nathan put cement in that tree, Atticus, and he did it to stop us finding things. He's crazy, I reckon, like they say, but Atticus, I swear to God, he ain't ever harmed us. He ain't ever hurt us. He could have cut my throat from ear to ear that night, but he tried to mend my pants instead. He ain't ever hurt us, Atticus. Atticus said, whoa, son. So gently that I was greatly heartened. It was obvious that he had not followed a word Jem said, for all Atticus said was, you're right. We better keep this in the blanket to ourselves. Someday, maybe, Scout can thank him for covering her up. Thank who? I asked. She still hasn't figured out. Not until it's spelled out right here. Boo Radley. You were so busy looking at the fire you didn't know it when he put the blanket around you. My stomach turned to water, and I nearly threw up when Jem held out the blanket and crept toward me. He sneaked out of the house, turned around, sneaked up, and went like this, Atticus said dryly. Do not let this inspire you to further glory, Jeremy. Jem scowled. I ain't going to do anything to him, but I watched the spark of fresh adventure leave his eyes. Just think, Scout, he said, if you'd have just turned around, you'd have seen him. So this right here, this whole section, Mr. Nathan Radley put this in, when Jem is just everything that has happened, it brings me back to when Jem was crying about the cement in the tree and how he felt so empathetic in regard to Boo Radley no longer having a way to connect with people. And if Atticus brings the blanket back to Mr. Nathan Radley, then Mr. Nathan Radley will know that Arthur left the house to put the blanket around Scout. And if he filled the tree with cement when Arthur Radley was just innocently leaving kids' stuff, well, who knows what Nathan Radley would do to Boo Radley for leaving the house and giving Scout the blanket. So Jem is looking out for Arthur Radley in this moment. And Atticus, okay, agrees. And Scout barely figures out, we have to tell her that it's Boo Radley. And I don't know that she fully understands the other stuff, about wanting to protect him, about wanting to protect him from Nathan Radley. So it's lovely to see the way Miss Maudie reacts to her house burning down. Really, she's just like, no big deal. Now I have more room for my flowers. I can build a smaller house and I can have way more flowers. So it's pretty lovely. As we get into chapter 9, we switch from a focus on, inferencing things about Boo Radley, and Harper Lee starts to layer in elements of the trial that takes focus in part 2. So we hear a lot about Atticus defending Black people, and when people are talking about it, they do use the N word. And that's what brings Scout to want to raise her fists. So they start saying that Atticus is an N word lover, and that he defends N words. And that word and the way that it's not even the word, but it's the way that they're saying it, that Scout can tell that they're saying something bad about her dad, but she doesn't fully understand what it is. And so Scout's defense in any situation like that is to just start beating people up. So Cecil Jacobs made her forget in regard to fighting. And so when she goes to have a conversation with him, we get another one of these really poignant and important conversations in the book. We often get them, between Atticus and Scout. So we've got the earlier one about Miss Caroline and about not wanting to go to school. And now we have this one. So right here is what I'd like to read with you. But I was worrying another bone. Do all lawyers defend Negroes, Atticus? Of course they do, Scout. Then why did Cecil say you defended N-words? He made it sound like you were running a still, and running a still would be, creating alcohol, in your house. So basically saying he made it sound like you were doing something terrible. Atticus sighed. I'm simply defending a Negro. His name's Tom Robinson. He lives in that settlement beyond the town dump. He's a member of Calpurnia's church, and Cal knows his family well. She says they're clean living folks. Scout, you aren't old enough to understand some things yet, but there's been some high talk around town to the effect that I shouldn't do much about defending this man. It's a peculiar case. It won't come to trial until summer session. John Taylor was kind enough to give us a postponement. If you shouldn't be defending him, then why are you doing it? For a number of reasons, said Atticus. The main one is, if I didn't, I couldn't hold up my head in town. I couldn't represent this county in the legislature. I couldn't even tell you or Jem not to do something again. You mean if you didn't defend that man, Jem and me wouldn't have to mind you anymore? That's about right. Why? Because I can never ask you to mind me again. Scout, simply by the nature of the work, every lawyer gets at least one case in his lifetime that affects him personally. This one's mine, I guess. You might hear some ugly talk about it at school, but do one thing for me, if you will. You just hold your head high and keep those fists down. No matter what anybody says to you, don't let them get your goat. Try fine with your head for a change. It's a good one, even if it does resist learning. Atticus, are we going to win it? No, honey. Then why? Simply because we were licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us not to try to win, Atticus said. And that line right there is another one of those poignant lines that we need to hold on to and put it up next to the empathy quote in regard to walking around in someone else's shoes. This is another really famous quote. This is an allusion, to the Civil War. And so basically, if Tom Robinson is a black man in a very segregated southern Alabama town in this time period, it's just unlikely that he is going to win this case. And so, but Atticus knows that he should do his best to defend the man. Tom Robinson is his name. We don't know the details in regard to the case yet. Like I said, we're layering that in. But we start to see how the case is affecting Scout prior to even getting all the details in regard to what the case is about. That takes focus in part 2. We get to see Uncle Jack, Aunt Alexandra, and Francis in this chapter in regard to their trip to the Finch's Landing for Christmas. And she has some interesting conversations with Uncle Jack. We get to see her not wanting to be a lady. We get to see Aunt Alexandra being frustrated with that. But what really takes center stage here is that Scout ends up fighting again. Particularly, it's particularly interesting because it's her cousin. It's her cousin Frances who brings her to this place. I'm not going to read all of this, but all of this right here is sort of how it gets set up. Francis is talking about what he's heard secondhand from Aunt Alexandra about all the rumors that are going around about what Atticus is doing in regard to raising these kids. And then also now that he's taken this case. And so slowly but surely, particularly in using the N-word lover phrase, Frances gets Scout's goat and she absolutely loses it. And when he finally gets her to this place, this last one right here, this time I split my knuckle to the bone on his front teeth, my left impaired. I sailed in with my right, but not for long. Uncle Jack pinned my arms to my sides and said, "Stand still." Aunt Alexandra ministered to Francis, wiping his tears away with her handkerchief, rubbing his hair, patting his cheek. Atticus, Jem, and Uncle Jimmy had come to the back porch when Francis started yelling. "Who started this?" said Uncle Jack. Francis and I pointed at each other. "Grandma," he bawled. "She called me a whore lady and jumped on me." "Is that true, Scout?" said Uncle Jack. "I reckon so." When Uncle Jack looked down at me, his features were like Aunt Alexandra's. "You know I told you you'd get in trouble if you used words like that. I told you, didn't I?" "Yes, sir, but—" "Well, you're in trouble now. Stay there." So she starts to run and yells at Uncle Jack. She's so mad at him, she doesn't get a chance to tell her side of the story, but a little bit later she does. Uncle Jack takes some steps back when they get back to Macomb County, to get back to the house. um, they have this beautiful conversation where he finally says, "Okay, tell me your side of the story." And when she does, he gets really upset. He can't believe that Francis said that. And he knows a little bit about the trial. He's heard about it. And he wants to do something about it, but Scout makes him promise, not to. And then this right here, this final conversation in chapter 9, I am going to read to you. I'm going to point out the end first. You have read this already, right? But right here, Uncle Jack was a prince of a fellow to not let me down, but I never figured out how Atticus knew I was listening. And it was not until many years later that I realized he wanted me to hear every word he said. Writer's craft, point of view. Again, for the majority of the novel, Scout talks to us as she's seeing things at the age that the plot is happening, second grade. But every once in a while, we get these gems of a moment where older Harper Lee, where older Jean Louise Finch looks back and says, "It wasn't until many years later that I realized that he wanted me to hear these things." So knowing that and going back and looking at this again, what did Atticus knew she was sitting there. So what did Atticus want her to hear? So let's go back and look at it and see. "I shall never marry, Atticus." "Why? I might have children." Atticus said, "You've a lot to learn, Jack." "I know. Your daughter gave me my first lesson this afternoon. She said I didn't understand children much and told me why. She was quite right. Atticus, she told me how I should have treated her." "Oh, dear, I'm so sorry I romped on her." Atticus chuckled. "She earned it, so don't feel too remorseful." I waited on tender hooks for Uncle Jack to tell Atticus my side of it, but he didn't. He simply murmured, "Her use of bathroom invective leaves nothing to the imagination, but she doesn't know the meaning of half she says. She asked me what a whore lady was." "Did you tell her?" "No, I told her about Lord Melbourne." "Jack, when a child asks you something, answer him, for goodness sake. But don't make a production of it. Children are children, but they can spot an evasion quicker than adults, and evasion simply muddles them." "No," my father mused. "You had the right answer this afternoon, but the wrong reasons. Bad language is a stage all children go through, and it dies with time when they learn they're not attracting attention with it. Hot-headedness isn't. Scout's got to learn to keep her head and learn soon with what's in store for her these next few months. She's coming along, though. Jem's getting older, and she follows his example a good bit now. All she needs is assistance sometimes." "Atticus, you've never laid a hand on her." "I admit that. So far, I've been able to get by with threats." "Jack, she minds me as well as she can. Doesn't come up to scratch half the time, but she tries." "That's not the answer," said Uncle Jack. "No. The answer is she knows. I know she tries. That's what makes the difference. What bothers me is that she and Jem will have to absorb some ugly things pretty soon. I'm not worried about Jem keeping his head, but Scout would just as soon jump on someone as look at him if her pride's at stake." I waited for Uncle Jack to break his promise. He still didn't. "Atticus, how bad is this going to be? You haven't had too much chance to discuss it." And he is asking, Uncle Jack is asking about the trial now. Couldn't be worse, Jack. The only thing we've got is a black man's word against the Yules. The evidence boils down to you did, I didn't. The jury couldn't possibly be expected to take Tom Robinson's word against the Yules. Are you acquainted with the Yules? Jack said yes, he remembered them. He described them to Atticus, but Atticus said, "You're a generation off. The present ones are the same, though." What are you going to do then? Our understanding of names, again, has become so important. So if you think back to our comparisons of the Cunninghams and the Yules, remember that they're both of those families are poor, white, and uneducated. But there are some details about the family that Atticus reminds Uncle Jack of. But right here, the evidence boils down to you did, I didn't. So it boils down to Tom Robinson's word against the Yules, a black man's word against a white man's word. And he admits, that the jury can't possibly be expected to take a black man's word over a white man's word. So what are you going to do then? Before I'm through, I intend to jar the jury a bit. I think we'll have a reasonable chance on appeal, though. I really can't tell at this stage, Jack. I'd hope to get through life without a case of this kind, but John Taylor pointed at me and said, "You're it. Let this cup pass from you, eh?" Right. But do you think I could face my children otherwise? You know what's going to happen as well as I do, Jack, and I hope and pray I can get Jem and Scout through it without bitterness, and most of all, without catching Makeham's usual disease. Why reasonable people go stark, raving mad when anything involving a Negro comes up is something I don't pretend to understand. I just hope that Jem and Scout come to me for their answers instead of listening to the town. I hope they trust me enough. Jean Louise, my scalp jumped. I stuck my head around the corner. "Sir?" "Go to bed." I scurried to my room and went to bed. And I read the rest of it to you earlier. So, really, I think he wants her to hear all of this. But that last paragraph in particular, I hope they know to come to me. I hope they trust me enough. I hope they come to me with the questions that they have. And ultimately, his hope is that they get through it without catching Makeham's usual disease. Usually I would ask you what that was. So, what do you think it is? What is Makeham's usual disease that Atticus hopes his kids don't catch? So, just a quick review as we finish up and move into the last two chapters of part one. Chapter 8 is all about inferences, continuing to build on those Boo Radley inferences. You, as a reader, if you didn't make the inference that Boo Radley was the one leaving items in the tree in chapter 7, then this chapter allows you to figure it out with Scout, which again is just another layer of Harper Lee's writer's craft and how she creates that point of view for you. In chapter 9, we start to develop theme, and we also start to have the major plot point from part 2 layered in. So she introduces the trial by asking us to look at these rumors that caused Scout to fight. And we also get those really specific details between that conversation between Uncle Jack and Atticus at the end of the chapter. This quote is extremely significant, and I want you to watch out for this idea in chapter 11. Simply because we were licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us not to try to win. So simply because we know we're defeated and there's no way that we can conquer this hill that we're trying to climb, that's no reason why we shouldn't still climb the hill if we know it's the right thing to do. So going back to this idea of courage that's being developed, pay attention to it, particularly in regard to chapter 11. So one of the questions that could very well show up on a quiz would be, how does this quote show itself in chapter 11? All right. Keep an eye out for that, and I'll see you next time.